Hey there. You're listening to True Story No Cap. Real stories, no exaggeration, no lies. Just the raw, unfiltered moments life throws our way. Relax, lean back, and let's get started. Alice hurried down the hospital corridor bathed in light. She needed to finish the paperwork as quickly as possible. Today promised to be busy, 2 complex surgeries, and one of them on a girl whose family was closely tied to her past. A past she wished she could forget, for it held too much pain, injustice, fear, and resentment. It seemed all that was behind her. A new life had begun, and nothing reminded her of the burdensome years of her youth. However, just recently, the past had knocked on her door again. But this time, the meeting was completely different. The very same people sat in the office. It was as if Alice had been doused with ice water. She recognized them instantly, although many years had passed since she, a very young girl with a light backpack on her back, had literally run away from home. Both of them had changed, but Alice couldn't fail to recognize them. The conversation was long and painful. They weren't looking for reproaches, though there were plenty of reasons for them. A terrible misfortune had simply befallen them. After that, don't say you don't believe in the boomerang of fate. And, as often happens, this boomerang hit a completely innocent small person. He, or rather she, needed help. Alice, as a practicing doctor, had encountered similar cases and knew how to act. That night after the meeting, Alice couldn't sleep for a long time. Her children had long been in the deepest sleep in their rooms. Her beloved husband was breathing steadily and deeply in his sleep. Alice tossed and turned, remembering, and although she didn't want to, scenes from the past rose before her eyes like frames from an old film. Alice didn't remember her mother. She knew her mother had once been there, but the girl was only 4 years old when her dearest person passed away. Alice learned about her parent from her father, who, however, didn't particularly like remembering his first wife, partly because it caused him pain. As she grew older, Alice noticed the sadness in his eyes whenever her mother was mentioned, but Susan appeared in their home, a woman who entered their lives when Alice was 7 and immediately took the place of full mistress of the house. The stepmother couldn't stand any mention of her predecessor, so her father remained silent, not wanting to upset his current wife unnecessarily. Alice had another relative, her mother's cousin, Aunt Helen. She lived in another city. Since childhood, Alice had visited her for a week or 2 a year during school holidays. And before Helen moved away, niece and aunt saw each other much more often. That was a happy time. Aunt Helen took the girl to theaters and museums. They walked, talked, and laughed. Aunt Helen's son Andrew, already a high schooler, helped his younger cousin with maths, carried her around the city on his strong shoulders, and sometimes took her with him on walks. All his friends, especially the girls, were very fond of Alice. It was wonderful. But Susan couldn't stand Aunt Helen. Even little Alice understood this. The stepmother spoke ill of her, with obvious disdain. Aunt Helen was not welcome in Alice's house, and this upset and surprised the girl. How could anyone not love Aunt Helen? She was so kind, good, and cheerful. Aunt Helen often told Alice about her mother, mostly interesting stories from their shared childhood and youth. The cousins were very close. They went through a lot together, good and bad, fun and dangerous. Aunt Helen sincerely admired Tanya, and Alice simply adored listening to these stories and looking at the photographs that preserved the memory of the dearest person she didn't remember at all. How happy your mother was when you were born. Aunt Helen smiled, looking at Alice. She was simply flying on wings. We made all sorts of plans together, how we would raise you, develop you, educate you. You had such tiny fingers, so delicate as if they were already skilled. Your mother dreamed that you would become a surgeon, that you would save people. She had a weak heart since childhood, a complex defect, and no one could cure her. She wanted her daughter to help people like herself, to make them healthy and happy. By the way, it didn't escape Alice's notice that Aunt Helen herself felt a strong dislike for Susan, and for her father too. No, the aunt didn't say anything like that. The girl saw it in the change in Helen's voice, in the expression in her eyes. Alice worried. Why couldn't the adults who meant so much to her stand each other, barely restraining themselves when they met to avoid saying nasty things? Susan constantly found reasons for dissatisfaction. Either Alice came home at the wrong time, or she wasn't dressed properly for a walk, or she hadn't finished all her holiday homework. There were always nits to pick. Imperceptibly, Alice started visiting Aunt Helen less and less, and then some scandal happened between the adults, and communication with Helen stopped altogether. Aunt Helen only called one more time after that argument. Susan graciously allowed them to talk. "Sweetheart, don't think I'm abandoning you," Aunt Helen said. "It's just how circumstances are. You're still little, you won't understand. You know my address. If anything happens, be sure to come. I'll help you in a difficult moment. Remember that. You can always count on me." And that was it. That was their last conversation. After that, it was as if a line had been drawn. Susan said that Aunt Helen had her own affairs, that her son was applying to university, that she had problems with work and didn't have time for her niece. But Alice understood everything. She heard Aunt Helen call the home phone, but Susan would answer and speak to her rudely, not calling Alice to the phone. One day, Alice spotted Aunt Helen from the car window. She was standing in their yard. She waved to her, but Susan distracted her, and the car sped away, leaving Aunt Helen behind. Apparently, she was trying to see her niece, and it wasn't easy as she lived in another city and had to leave her affairs to come here. But her father and stepmother actively shielded Alice from contact with Aunt Helen. They were both united in their dislike. It was hard for Alice at first without communication with her beloved Aunt Helen, the only one who supported and understood her. At home, things were far from rosy. Her father and stepmother had a daughter, Vicky. At first, Alice was even happy. An adorable baby, a sister, a little doll. But the joy didn't last long. Firstly, Alice suddenly saw how tender and loving parents could be towards a particular child. Her father worked a lot, so he couldn't give his daughter as much attention as she would have liked. He would ask sometimes, how was school, how was she feeling? But it was clear that her answers didn't interest him much. And when Alice asked him to play with her, to give her a piggyback ride like Andrew, Aunt Helen's son, often did, to go for a walk in the park, or even play football, he would brush her off. And his gaze was distant, as if while talking to his daughter, he was thinking about something else. Susan irritated Alice even more. The girl tried to behave perfectly to earn her favor. She did her homework, cleaned up after herself, played quietly and unobtrusively, but Susan always found something to scold her stepdaughter for. This wasn't right. That wasn't right. And again, Susan's look, at an annoying obstacle. It was impossible not to notice. And yet, the girl had been so drawn to her at first. She wanted what other girls had. Shopping trips with her stepmother, heart-to-heart talks, cooking together. But Susan avoided such interaction in every way. However, she did fulfill her parental duties. No one from the outside could blame Susan for not looking after the girl properly. And then Vicky was born. And in their attitude towards her, Alice saw her father and Susan from a completely different side, and realized that they could be like that too. Loving, caring, attentive. Just not with her, but with Vicky. Vicky's smile, her cooing, her first little achievements, all of it filled her parents with delight. They could spend ages admiring their little daughter playing in her playpen or even just sleeping. They stood over her crib so happy, exchanging glances. They even threw lavish birthday parties for Vicky with their last money, buying her only the best. Alice received things on a residual basis. The slightest successes of her younger sister were elevated to the rank of genius, while Alice, no matter how hard she tried, couldn't earn even a little praise. She studied very well, she was an honor student. But this was taken for granted. It was this contrast that hurt. No, Alice didn't envy her sister's dolls and outfits. After all, she herself was clothed. The matter was completely different. Vicky's parents always listened to her with genuine interest. They enjoyed spending time with her. They often delighted in her answers. But Alice, she felt like an outsider in this family, completely estranged. Her father still sometimes tried to talk to his elder daughter, supposedly heart to heart. It was clear he was making an effort, and in reality, he wasn't particularly interested in hearing about Alice's life. Susan, however, was simply irritated by her stepdaughter, and over the years, the woman almost stopped hiding it. Later, Alice guessed that it was Susan who turned her father against her, only spoke badly about her, and presented her stepdaughter in a negative light. She did this very skillfully and artfully. Her husband didn't even suspect his wife's intentions, especially since he was hardly ever home anyway. He worked a lot. He was even grateful to his new wife for helping him, raising, nurturing, and cherishing his child. Her father worked rotational shifts, and Alice lived for months only with Susan and Vicky, feeling like a stranger in her own apartment. Alice gradually acquired many responsibilities. She had to clean the rooms before Susan came home from work, go to the store, prepare dinner, and take Vicky to clubs and sections. 90% of the time, Vicky was too young to get to her enrichment classes on her own, so Alice accompanied her, in addition to having many household chores, not to mention her studies. There was a lot of homework in high school. Alice was used to doing everything conscientiously, so she stayed up late with little time left for rest. Alice tried to reason with Susan, to explain to her stepmother that it was very difficult for her to live on such a schedule. Of course, it brought no results. "You're just lazy," Susan sighed, "like most modern teenagers. But we, your parents, are responsible for your upbringing and are doing everything for your own good." It was useless to approach her father. He had been subtly influenced by Susan and was also grateful to her for raising his daughter so well, instilling a love for work and reasonable strictness. Her father sincerely believed that Susan was to be thanked for Alice not hanging out in yards with other teenagers, not drinking beer on benches with them, not smoking. "You'll appreciate it later," he explained to his elder daughter when she tried to talk about her dreams. "Because of your age, you just don't understand what Susan is doing for you. She's preparing you for adult life." For adult life? Alice wanted to cry from resentment then. She wasn't a little girl anymore and knew what she wanted to become. A surgeon, preferably a cardiac surgeon, to learn how to treat those others had given up on. But you couldn't just get into medical academy. It would be good to attend preparatory courses at the university as well. Alice talked to her parents, trying to convey how important these courses were to her. "But we're not doing very well with money right now." Susan shook her head. "And those courses of yours are expensive. We can't afford them. And besides, maybe you won't even need this. Today you want to be a doctor, tomorrow a ballerina. Right now it's this, and we have to pay for these whims when there's already not enough money." And that was the pure truth. Her father had some problems at work, his salary had decreased significantly and was often delayed. The family lived on savings, but money for Vicky's enrichment classes was always found, and they celebrated birthdays, bought dresses and treats. Her parents economized on everything except their adored younger daughter, and it was difficult to deny Vicky anything anymore. At the slightest hint, there were tears, tantrums, scandals, awful scenes with snot smeared across her cheeks and tiny feet stamping. At such moments, her father called Vicky a princess and hugged her close. Susan also cooed, and the little princess's every wish was immediately granted. Her parents couldn't bear to see her cry, couldn't refuse her anything. She wasn't like Alice. When the elder daughter tried to explain to her stepmother and father how she saw the situation, she ended up being blamed. "You don't understand that this is a child," her father said sternly. "A small child who doesn't yet understand financial problems. The little one should have a happy childhood." "It's all your spoilt nature and innate selfishness, too," Susan said, pressing her lips together, looking at Alice. "You're an adult and you don't understand anything. It's your jealousy, pathological jealousy. No, we missed something in your upbringing somewhere." Every time Alice tried to talk about something with her stepmother or father, she ended up being blamed, feeling misunderstood and rejected. Of course, no one paid for the medical academy preparatory courses. The girl's desire was considered a whim, and she was advised to study better. How could she study better? She already had straight A's, despite the excessive workload at home. By the way, Susan also considered Alice's academic success her own achievement, as she was the one who had instilled a love for work in Alice. It was her final year of school. Just a little more and Alice would graduate. She still hoped to get into medical academy. They hadn't paid for the courses, so the girl prepared herself. Thankfully, there was a lot of free literature online. Money was still tight in the family, but things seemed to be improving. Her father had found a new job, although it also involved long business trips. He had gone on rotational shifts before, but now he was away for 3 to 4 months at a time. On the other hand, the salary promised to be more than decent. Susan was happy about this. Vicky started school. Now Alice had another responsibility, doing homework with her sister. It wasn't easy. Firstly, Vicky had grown up very capricious. At the slightest thing, she'd burst into tears. The smallest difficulties would cause her a tantrum. She'd cry, complain to her mother, who would feel sorry for her and ask Alice to be gentler with the little one. How could she be any gentler? Secondly, Vicky found academics difficult, and she was restless. In short, Alice would break out in a sweat before her sister's homework was finished. And only then would the girl start her own assignments and again sit up late into the night, almost falling asleep during lessons at school the next morning. From Susan, Alice still saw only reproaches and complaints. Despite the fact that the girl did so much for her stepmother, helping with housework, raising Vicky, she saw no gratitude from Susan. She continued to perceive her stepdaughter as an obstacle without whom everyone would be better off. And now Alice had also grown up, become smarter, and started to understand a lot. This infuriated Susan even more. The stepmother didn't hide that she dreamed of the day Alice would set off on her own, fly out of the nest. She told her husband that life would improve and be completely different once their elder daughter was grown. In other words, even her father perceived Alice as some kind of annoying hindrance. Sometimes the girl shared her worries with her classmate Erin. She was quiet and intelligent, even wise despite her young age. Young herself, but with a soul that seemed old, having seen a lot. "Your stepmother is a typical stepmother." Erin shook her head, listening to Alice. "But never mind, life is like that. It will put everything in its place, you'll see. You'll remember my words. And you yourself will stand strong, and everything will be wonderful for you with such a core." Her classmates' words were encouraging, instilling hope for a bright future and giving her strength to live. Alice didn't give up on her dream. She wanted to be a surgeon and did a lot for it. And she knew. After finishing school, she would take her documents to the medical academy. The academy was located in their city, just 3 stops from home. You could even walk. A tall, old building in the center. The girl often walked past it among the young men and women hurrying to this temple of science for classes. It was her dream. And now Alice held her diploma, red, special issue, and even a gold medal, a mark of distinction. Alice was happy and very pleased with herself. She didn't go to the graduation party. Susan said they didn't have that kind of money yet. But Alice herself wasn't too keen on going to that restaurant anyway. She hardly even felt disappointed. "Well," Susan said that evening on the day the diploma was awarded. Her father, as usual, was on a business trip. "Now you're an adult, you're almost 18. We've raised you all these years, given you everything. Clothes, food, a roof over your head. The moment has come for you to fly out of the parental nest." "Where?" Alice didn't understand. "Where do you mean?" "To work, of course." "What studying?" "Alice, just drop these silly fantasies. Stop dreaming of the impossible. Medical Academy? Do you know the competition there? I checked, 12 people per place. You won't get in. Don't even dream about it." I prepared and I feel capable." "That's just your overconfidence talking. You'll never get into a university like that. Something simpler, of course, is within your reach. But think. That's another 5 years of studying, and you need to work." "I need to study." Alice looked at her medal. "I'm good at it." "School is one thing." Susan started to get angry, but still tried to hide it. "But this is university. In school, they gave you grades for effort. In university, you'll have to study properly. There won't be time for anything else. And you're already an adult. You should support yourself, especially since we're short on money right now. Providing for an adult girl for several more years is an excessive burden for us. I'll talk to your father about this." "I already did, and he completely agrees with me." "Alice, you shouldn't waste years on studying. It's nonsense in our situation. People with those same diplomas end up working as cashiers alongside those who didn't finish university. I know that much." Susan herself worked as a cashier. She had an unfinished law college degree and often spoke with some schadenfreude about her cashier colleagues with economics and law degrees. "You just don't know life yet," she lectured her stepdaughter. "No universities, no courses, no buts. I've already made arrangements. I have a friend who's the chief accountant at a housing association, and they need a janitor. It's not bad for a start. The most important thing is they provide housing for their employees for next to nothing in a reserve fund. So you can move out tomorrow and start your own life." And then Alice got angry. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to speak like that to her stepmother. "You have no right to decide my fate. I will be a surgeon. That's definite. It's my dream. And you are no longer in charge of me. You've humiliated me my whole life. Do you think I don't see and understand anything?" Alice was truly worked up. She had never spoken to her parents like this. She simply hadn't dared. But here, all the resentment accumulated over the years seemed to burst out. The girl shouted about her feelings, about the injustice, and strangely, it made her feel lighter. She understood that after this, everything, absolutely everything, would change. "Oh, you ungrateful wretch." Susan looked at her stepdaughter with unconcealed hatred. "Get out of here if you're so smart and independent." "This is my home, too," Alice calmly reminded her. "Mine and Father's. You have no right to kick me out, but I'll leave myself gladly." She began packing her things. She didn't take much: money, documents, clothes, for the first while. She ended up with a small, light backpack, just right. Alice knew where to go, though she couldn't have guessed what awaited her there. After all, she hadn't spoken to Aunt Helen for so many years. But something told her she would be welcomed at Helen's house just as she had been in childhood, that she would be supported, helped, comforted, and given the strength to achieve her dream. She should have gone there long ago instead of enduring the torment. She left the apartment without looking back. Susan didn't even turn around. Alice had no doubt, of course, she would tell her father and portray her as always rude, ungrateful, almost a criminal. Her father would believe it. He believed his wife's every word. It was easier, more convenient for him that way. What's done is done. It was time to admit that even her own father didn't understand or accept his daughter. He had made his choice. Nothing more connected Alice with this family. Well, except for the shared inheritance, of course, but it was too early to think about that. The waiting room. She bought a ticket to the city where Aunt Helen lived easily without problems. The intercity bus was due to depart in half an hour. Alice considered this stroke of luck a good sign and smiled. Although she was shaking from the emotions and anxiety she had experienced, the girl was almost certain. Her story would end well, and now, right now, she was taking an important and correct step. Aunt Helen was surprised to see her niece on her doorstep, but recognized her immediately, although the relatives hadn't seen each other since Alice was about 10 years old. They hugged. Finding herself in the embrace of a loved one, the girl finally let herself go. She burst into tears. Then they drank tea in the kitchen and talked. Alice told her about her life. Aunt Helen listened, shaking her head, sighing. "Listen," she said when Alice had finished talking. "You're staying here with me. There's a medical academy in our city, too. If you don't get in now, you can prepare for a year, and then they'll definitely take you next year." "I'd really like to, but Father, what if he doesn't allow it?" "You'll be 18 in a week. You can choose where to live yourself," Aunt Helen reminded her. "I won't let you go back there. I didn't realize how hard your life was there. If I had known, I would have taken you through court long ago." Aunt Helen told her how Susan had forbidden her to communicate with Alice and had also turned her father against her. But that wasn't difficult. He's been under her thumb for a long time. She convinced him that I was a bad influence on you, that I was saying bad things about them. And I called you often and even came to visit, but they wouldn't let me in, wouldn't let me see you, and the gifts I bought you were returned to me. I followed your life on social media. Sometimes Susan would post photos where you appeared, sometimes your father, but I never found your own page. I thought we could at least chat through messengers, but no. They didn't allow it. They didn't allow me to create social media accounts when I was a teenager. They said it took up too much time. And children had no business on the internet. There were many scammers there. And then, when I got older, I didn't feel like it myself anymore. Perhaps your parents were afraid that I would maintain contact with you?" Aunt Helen mused. "Hence the prohibitions." "And why? Why were they always so bad to you?" "Well, there is a reason." Aunt Helen smiled mysteriously. "You're an adult now. I'll tell you the story. And then you'll understand everything." Tanya and Helen were cousins, more than sisters. They were the best of friends. They constantly stayed over at each other's houses, walked to school together, hung out. Later, when they were older, they went dancing. Tanya and Helen had no secrets from each other. They shared their most intimate thoughts. Tanya had a weak heart since childhood. She was often in the hospital. Helen would rush to her right after school, to her best friend. The doctors knew her and always let her in, even if it wasn't visiting hours. The adults, observing the sisters' friendship, would joke, "Just wait until you fall in love with the same guy, and that'll be the end of your friendship." The girls would declare in unison that would never happen. And it didn't. Helen was the first to get married, to a guy she met at university, tall, handsome, smart, kind. Tanya approved of her sister's choice. "You'll be happy with him." They were indeed happy, though not for long. Helen soon became a young widow. Her husband drowned while saving 2 teenagers at the city beach. He pushed the boys out, but he himself. Helen was a very young mother at the time. Her son Andrew had just turned 2. Of course, Tanya was there for the inconsolable Helen during that difficult time. She even stayed at her sister's apartment for a while, looking after her, little Andrew, trying to rouse her, distract her. Time passed, and Helen slowly but surely began to recover. Life seemed to settle down, stabilize. Of course, she grieved for her husband, but she finally started thinking about herself again. Tanya was happy for her sister, as she had been seriously worried about her condition for a long time. Then Tanya also got married to Robert, a man a little older than her, serious, steady. He earned well, though he had to work hard, which couldn't help but earn Helen's respect. Tanya's chosen one didn't exactly displease her. She just didn't understand what could have attracted her sister to him. They seemed to be cut from different cloth. Robert wasn't very talkative, even stern. He didn't understand their jokes. And Helen considered that a serious drawback. "You see, next to him I feel," Tanya tried to explain, "well, like behind a stone wall." And Helen understood. Tanya, her beloved sister, had lost her parents early. Perhaps she needed a reliable shoulder to lean on. And Robert, he was just that kind of person. Immediately after the wedding, Robert bought a large apartment in a prestigious area of the city. It turned out he had savings, plus his work decided to help out a valuable employee. Tanya enthusiastically set about furnishing the new home. They went shopping, chose curtains, chandeliers, and other important interior elements. It was exciting and pleasant. Soon, a child appeared in the young family, a girl, Alice. Helen's son Andrew was already quite grown up, almost a teenager. By the way, this wonderful little one might not have been born at all. Doctors advised Tanya against having a child. Her heart was weak, and it was unknown how her body might react. But Tanya believed that a family wasn't a family without a child, and her husband Robert dreamed of heirs. So they decided to go for it. The pregnancy went perfectly, despite the doctor's fears. The girl was born healthy and strong. It seemed everything had turned out wonderfully, but not quite. A year after giving birth, Tanya's condition began to worsen. The strain on her not-so-healthy body took its toll. But Tanya regretted nothing. She followed the doctor's recommendations, underwent checkups, and took her medication. In short, she looked after her health and tried not to get nervous. The doctors say that with my condition, the most important thing is positive emotions and no stress. "Well, you have plenty of positive emotions," Helen smiled, looking at her sweet, funny niece. "That's for sure. And I have no stress. Everything is good in our family." Helen hoped that over time she would get to know Robert better, become friends with him. After all, he wasn't a stranger. He was her beloved sister's husband, but he remained just as distant and silent. He would come home and, finding Helen visiting, would greet her curtly and go into the bedroom. Does he not like me?" Helen asked Tanya. "No. What are you talking about? He's just like that. And he has a lot of work lately. He gets tired. He's rarely home. Constant delays, business trips. What can you do? It's a managerial position. But at least my daughter and I lack nothing. And otherwise, he's good, kind. He takes care of us, doesn't refuse us anything." But Helen knew her sister perfectly well and saw that Tanya was slightly dissembling. It seemed she herself was upset. Something wasn't right. Another year and a half passed. Alice had grown up and even started going to kindergarten. And Tanya was constantly in hospitals. She was home less often. She had to visit doctors more frequently than ordinary people and carefully monitor her condition. Robert provided for the family, but spent very little time with his daughter and wife. He was constantly on business trips, staying late at the office. And at home, he behaved distantly, which Tanya explained as her husband's fatigue in her sister's eyes, or perhaps even in her own. But Helen saw, she understood, something was wrong. She felt sorry for her sister, and one day, Helen saw her suspicions confirmed with her own eyes. Yes, Robert was indeed cheating on her. That day, she got a call from school saying Andrew had a fever and had been sent home. The anxious mother asked her boss for time off. You never know, maybe her son needed help. It wasn't clear what condition he was in. That's why she was rushing through the train station at that moment. It was a shortcut home. And she saw them, Robert and his companion. Beautiful, slender, tall, with a fashionable, model-like appearance, as they used to say back then. They were coming out of the waiting room. He was pulling both suitcases, his and hers. And Robert was completely different from how Helen was used to seeing him. Animated, his eyes shining, his mouth never closed, a smile never leaving his face. He looked at his companion with what seemed like adoration, and she seemed to allow herself to be admired. And Helen stopped, watching the couple as they passed. A couple of times Robert put his arm around the young woman's waist, pulling her closer to whisper something in her ear, and even kissed her once. Passionately and quickly, because she almost immediately playfully pushed him away. In short, there was no doubt left. And this was despite the fact that Tanya had said her husband had gone on another business trip, but the train that had just arrived at the station was a direct route from Sochi. Apparently Robert and the beauty hadn't gone on a business trip, but to a resort to relax. Helen even stamped her foot in annoyance. The doctors had advised Tanya to breathe the sea air, but Robert had said he didn't have time, but to relax with his lover, that was perfectly fine. Helen thought for a long time whether to tell Tanya. On the one hand, her husband was cheating, and Helen herself would prefer to know such things, even if the truth was incredibly bitter. But Tanya? Her heart was weak. The doctors recommended avoiding stress. Wouldn't the news be too hard for her? In short, Helen decided not to bother Tanya, but instead to talk to Robert frankly. For this important conversation, the woman went to her sister's husband's workplace. Robert's office was located in the city center. Robert was surprised to see his wife's sister at the office door. "Has something happened?" he asked. "Something has happened," Helen replied grimly, and without waiting for an invitation, sat down opposite Robert, pulling a chair up to the desk. And the woman told Robert what she had seen at the station, in detail, not omitting anything. Robert listened calmly without even raising an eyebrow. And then, "Yes, I have a woman. There are real feelings between us. We have to meet in secret. I'm not thrilled about it myself, but why? Why?" "Well, sometimes it happens. Feelings fade. I thought Tanya was the one, the only one. I was mistaken. Susan, with her, everything is different, completely. I would have told my wife a long time ago, but her heart is weak. Tanya's condition is unstable right now. The doctors say it's another crisis. When it passes, I'll confess everything. We'll get divorced. I'll help her get settled in life. Don't worry. But telling her about Susan now is like sending her to the grave. You understand that, don't you?" Helen thought about it. Of course Robert was right, 100% right. He was, of course, a cad and a traitor for having an affair with this Susan while married, but in his own way, he was protecting the mother of his child from severe stress that could be detrimental to her condition. In short, they agreed with Robert to keep silent for now. It was indeed much better for everyone involved in this story. For everyone except Susan herself, though she weakly believed this. One fine moment. Helen still remembered that late evening, almost night, in detail. Andrew was asleep in his room. He had to get up early for school. Helen was also getting ready for bed, but couldn't tear herself away from her favorite TV show. And then the phone rang. Anxiety immediately gripped the woman's heart. She felt something was wrong. It was too late for a casual chat. "How are you related to Tanya Petrova?" a strange male voice asked on the phone. "Her sister," Helen replied, turning cold with horror. She still hoped it wasn't that bad. "You need to come and pick up the child. Her husband is on a business trip and the daughter is too young to be left alone." "What about Tanya?" "You need to come," the voice repeated, and as soon as possible. Of course, Helen called a taxi and was at her sister's apartment about 15 minutes later. There was something... Too many people, doctors, police. They talked to Helen, told her everything. She literally slid down the wall to the floor, sat right on the cold laminate, covering her face with her hands. Tanya had had an attack. She died instantly. The doctors didn't make it in time. Little, confused Alice came up to Helen. Fear and incomprehension were in the girl's eyes. Looking at her, Helen understood. She needed to pull herself together. She was needed by her niece. "Will you take the child?" the man in uniform asked. "Of course," Helen nodded. "Of course I'll take her." And Alice did indeed spend almost a month at Helen's place. Robert was sorting out some work matters. He now had to look after his daughter. What business trips could there be? He was looking for a nanny. All this time, Alice lived with Helen. Andrew helped his mother look after the little one and did so with great pleasure. And then Alice's father picked her up, who, with his characteristic seriousness, promised to visit her. Can I come and see her? Helen asked. You should. I made you a key to the apartment. Come whenever you want. Alice is so drawn to you. Okay. And can I ask something? I think I even know what, Robert nodded. You want to know if I told Tanya? Well, about Susan? You're assuming the attack happened because of that? Yes, of course I didn't tell her anything. Robert looked at Alice with a direct, sincere gaze. I would never, under any circumstances, have done that. We talked about this, remember? I knew such truth was dangerous for Tanya. Helen believed him. And then, several months after the tragedy, Helen found something among her sister's things. Alice was truly happy that day. She didn't leave her aunt's side for a moment. When Tanya was visiting them, niece and aunt decided to play dress-up. It was fun. The 4-year-old adored dressing up and transforming herself, and Helen admittedly did too. Both of them enjoyed the game, and they even put on music. Helen opened her sister's wardrobe. Her heart tightened as usual at the sight of Tanya's things, which she would never need again. They had chosen this blouse together, and Tanya was wearing this skirt when they last went to the cinema, not knowing then, of course, that it was the last time. Helen sighed and tried to reach for a hat on the top shelf. The hat caught on something, she reached further, and a pile of things tumbled down, right onto Helen. They were hats, scarves, and several photographs, neatly tied with a ribbon. Helen bent down to pick up the photos and froze. The photographs showed Robert and Susan hugging and kissing. One photo looked particularly romantic. Robert and Susan against the backdrop of a stunningly beautiful sea sunset, tanned, clearly in love. So that was it. Tanya had found out after all. Perhaps that was why the attack happened. Helen turned over one of the pictures. There was an inscription, apparently made with a lip pencil. Let him go. He doesn't love you anymore. He's only with you because of your daughter. He won't leave because you're sick, so take the first step. A terrible text, wounding words. Helen imagined what it must have been like for her sister to suddenly receive this message and the note on the back of one of the pictures. She called Robert, who behaved very strangely. Why are you doing this? I've already lost my wife. I haven't recovered from that grief yet. And now you're setting up Susan too. Why are you doing this? I understand you're upset that Tanya is gone. Maybe that's why you don't want me to be happy either, and that's why you staged this charade? What are you talking about? Where would I get these photos? You don't understand anything at all. Your woman deliberately sent Tanya to her grave. She's a terrible person. She did this. But Robert stuck to his story, and Helen understood. Susan, that attractive, slender woman, had enormous influence over him, which is why he believed her. Cunning, cold, and deceitful. Helen had no doubt Susan had latched onto Robert only because of his apartment, and also his position and decent income. She had a goal, and she achieved it. She destroyed her main rival. Maybe she didn't want her death, but the tragedy certainly benefited her. They hadn't talked much before, but now, not at all. Helen saw Alice often. Usually she took the girl for the weekends. Robert still worked a lot. It seemed nothing now prevented the widower and his lover from being happy together, but for some reason, the man wasn't in a hurry to bring Susan home. They met on neutral ground, lived together on holiday, but in everyday life they lived separately, and only about 3 years after the tragedy did Robert propose to his lover and bring her home to his daughter. Alice was already in first grade then, and since Susan became Robert's legal wife, Helen was gradually discouraged from visiting the house. Helen, by the way, had moved to another city by then, bought a larger apartment there, and found a good job. She even thought about taking Alice for good because, well, why would Robert need her in his new family? She wanted to become her niece's guardian, which is why she had improved her living conditions, so there would be no obstacles. But, unexpectedly, Robert declared that he would raise his daughter himself. This was strange. He had never shown particular love or attachment to the girl, and he hadn't looked after her either. He had simply hired a nanny after his wife died. They gradually cut off our communication. Helen looked at her now adult niece. It wasn't difficult, given that I now lived in another city. Susan, she tried in every way to keep you away from me because she perfectly understood. I knew everything. I knew what she had done to Tanya. And probably she was afraid that I would tell you everything, that I would somehow prove I was right to Robert, and he would kick her out. In short, it was understandable that she was uncomfortable having someone like me nearby, someone who knew all her secrets. So they pushed me out. But I tried. I tried to see you. But they were the parents, the legal guardians, and I essentially had no rights to communicate with you. And I thought Susan appeared later. Well, after Mom was gone. Maybe they delayed the wedding so you would think that later when you grew up? No. Susan was in your father's life before the tragedy, and most likely, she was the reason for what happened to your mother. I was scared to leave you with such a person, but what could I do? And I watched you from afar. From the outside, everything looked fine. You wouldn't even think how hard your life was there. How could she? She didn't even spare a child. I'm not going back to them. Of course you're not going back. You're almost 18 now. You can decide where to live yourself. Tomorrow we'll go to the university and find out what you need for admission. Did you bring your documents with you? Yes, I didn't have time to pack many things. That's nothing. We'll buy everything tomorrow. The main thing is the documents. Susan stood by the coffee machine, waiting for the massive appliance to make her hot chocolate. She was incredibly sleepy. Little Katerina had been restless all night again. Sometimes she had trouble breathing, sometimes her chest hurt. The illness of Susan's granddaughter, her most precious treasure, was progressing. The girl couldn't play with friends, couldn't go to kindergarten. Her daughter, Vicky. She was clearly not ready for such difficulties as a sick child. She'd freak out, be capricious, and even get angry at her own daughter, who wasn't at fault for anything. It was Vicky and her useless boyfriend who had made the baby in a drunken haze. And then, during the pregnancy, the future young mother hadn't exactly restrained herself. She smoked and drank beer. Susan tried to keep an eye on her daughter, but it was impossible. To watch an adult 24/7. People were right. They had indeed spoilt Vicky, but Susan had just wanted her daughter to be happy. Numerous enrichment classes, gifts, surprises, birthdays. Susan invested all the resources available to her and her child. Vicky had no household chores because her mother believed her girl would have enough time to work in life later. Robert. He didn't interfere much in the upbringing of his younger daughter, completely trusting his wife on this matter. And anyway, he was never home, earning money to support the family. Susan was sure. You couldn't spoil with love, childhood whims would pass with age, and her daughter would grow up strong, a self-respecting person. But Vicky at one point completely stopped studying because she was used to doing only what she wanted. She dropped out of school in 10th grade, declared she would never go to university, not even to a commercial faculty where almost everyone was accepted if you just paid, because she was tired of studying and wanted to finally enjoy life to the fullest. Vicky got involved with bad company and often came home drunk in the morning. Susan couldn't do anything with her daughter who had gone off the rails. Neither could Robert. He didn't know how to behave with Vicky at all. He had never really been involved in her upbringing, although he loved her very much. He transferred money, gave gifts. And then something terrible happened. Robert was in a car accident on the highway while driving home from another business trip, and Susan was left alone. However, she was quick to act, and Robert's apartment and accounts went solely to her and Vicky. Processing this property cost a lot of money and effort, but now it had paid off fully. As for Alice, she had been living in another city for a long time, far away, a lost cause. Susan wasn't particularly interested in her fate. Neither was Robert. They only knew that Alice had indeed gotten into medical school, as she had dreamed. No other information. Alice didn't maintain contact with her parents. Probably she was in touch with her aunt, with Helen. Well, that was fine. Susan was quite satisfied with that. The main thing was that Robert's apartment and money in his accounts went only to them. And then Vicky got pregnant by one of her perpetually drunk admirers. And Katerina was born, weak, pale. In the maternity hospital, she was diagnosed with a serious heart defect, one that people at best live with until 7-8 years old if they don't have surgery. And little Katerina is already 5. Of course, Susan threw all her efforts into her granddaughter's rehabilitation and treatment. She herself was surprised by the strength of feeling she felt for the little one. She had once dreamed that this money would provide them with a happy life without hardship and saving, but it turned out differently. Everything went into Katerina's quite expensive supportive treatment. The girl had undergone several operations which only slightly improved the situation, but didn't fundamentally solve the problem. It was terrifying to think about what could happen to her granddaughter. Even Vicky, usually carefree, unserious, and thinking only of herself, Even she seemed to understand that the fun was over and tried to look after her daughter as much as possible, but the main part of the care still fell on Susan's shoulders. In their city, everyone refused further treatment for Katerina. They didn't have the necessary facilities and specialists there. So Susan, Vicky, and Katerina went to Moscow. They were advised to go to a children's surgery center where there were supposedly almost wizards who helped even in the most severe cases. Getting an appointment was difficult, the waiting list was long, but Susan managed to get through. However, at the appointment they were disheartened. The queue was huge because people were coming from all over the country, and most patients were in situations similar to Katerina's, requiring urgent attention. No one could be moved up, and by that time, the girl's condition could well worsen to the point where no one would take her to the operating table. They prescribed the little one medication for now, but whether it would help or not, no one could say. Susan drank her hot chocolate, leaning her back against the light hospital wall. Nearby on a couch sat a bewildered Vicky, with Katerina sleeping on her lap, unaware of how serious everything was. And Susan could barely hold back tears of helplessness and despair. She could do nothing more. And suddenly, "Oh, Petrova, dear," one orderly was saying to another. Everyone had given up on him, his heart was full of holes. That's what the doctors said, hopeless. But she performed surgery at night in her free time, didn't leave the table for 5 hours and saved the boy. He'll live now and he'll become completely healthy, a miracle. Petrova is a pediatric cardiac surgeon sent by God. The other orderly nodded in agreement. And a good person? We need more people like that in the world. "Excuse me, where is Dr. Alice Petrova's office?" Susan rushed over to the orderlies and asked them to show her to the doctor's office. She was almost certain. No, it seemed too fantastic, but still. Alice was finishing another report when a woman from the past suddenly appeared at her office door, the one who had once caused her so much pain, so many problems, Susan. And next to her, holding a sleeping child, stood Vicky. Alice recognized her sister too, although she had last seen her when she was still in primary school. For some reason she felt fear, and also dislike, contempt, disgust, but also surprise, of course. And why? Why had the past sought her out at a time when everything in her life had finally settled and improved? Susan began to speak. She cried, asked for forgiveness, and seemed genuinely repentant for her behavior back then. "What happened? Maybe it's a boomerang, a punishment for me for how I treated you. But this child, a child who is not guilty of anything. You are our last hope, Alice. Take her for surgery, otherwise she won't live to see her turn. You do this sometimes, I know. You take on difficult children in your non-working hours. I can't ask you this after everything, but I am asking. There's no one else I can turn to." Alice looked at the little girl in her sister's arms, her niece as it turned out. And with surprise, she suddenly realized that she no longer felt resentment, and the dislike for these two individuals had also vanished somewhere. Before Alice were people, unhappy, frightened people who needed help. And a child, a seriously ill child. Alice asked for Katerina's documents. She needed to understand what they were dealing with. Susan readily pulled a thick folder from her bag. Analysis results, ultrasound reports, scans. Yes, the situation was indeed complex and couldn't tolerate delay, but Alice knew she could handle it. She had dealt with such cases before. True, she would, of course, have to sacrifice her free time again, but that was such a small price compared to a child's life that it wasn't even worth mentioning. Alice had gone into medicine to save people. This was her calling, her dream. "You'll need to repeat some of the tests," Alice said, "and don't worry. Everything will be fine.